Hi, it's Dwyer. It is May 25th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, yesterday we made a video where we talked about Moses Atama, and I was urging Alexander Usyk, if he beats Daniel Dubois, to fight Atama next. Right? Atama is the brightest young prospect in the heavyweight division right now, with all due respect to Richard Torres, who I don't think has Atama's back foot. Right? Jared Anderson, who got beaten by Martin Bakole off body shots and seemed to lose his way during that fight. Right? I would say that Moses Atama is the most promising prospect right now in boxing. Now, that can change on one punch. Right? But the bottom line is, he right now is unbeaten. He right now is showing prodigious power. He's also showing a back foot, a certain set of skills that might actually work well against Alexander Usyk. Let me point out, too, that Richard Torres's aggressive front foot, I believe, would also work out well against Alexander Usyk. But, right, that said, I think Atama right now is the more complete fighter. Now, understand, the choice that Usyk has to make has been made a lot easier for him. Because, believe it or not, the WBO has named Moses Atama as its #1 ranked contender. Folks, this is a dream scenario. Because understand, Usyk is fighting for the undisputed heavyweight championship. Right? If he beats Dubois, then he can concede some of the titles. Right? He will have already been undisputed twice. In other words, future generations are going to have a very hard time matching what Usyk's done. There are deserving men at heavyweight who really deserve an immediate shot at the heavyweight title. One of them is Joe Parker. I don't dispute that. Another is Ajit Kabayel. But understand what the WBO has just done. They've given Usyk the opportunity, the possibility. In fact, they've given Dubois the same possibility of keeping a title, the WBO title, while fighting the #1 WBO contender, Moses Atama. Right? So this would be an opportunity at box office. Now, the arguments are a little bit different, in my eyes, for Usyk versus Daniel Dubois. Right? Dubois is still in his 20s. Presumably, Dubois, if he beats Usyk, has plenty of time to fight Moses Atama. Right? Also, Dubois was scheduled to fight Joe Parker and had to withdraw. Of course, Parker would then go on to beat late replacement Martin Bakole. Right? So, a Joe Parker can show up at press conferences for Daniel Dubois and can call him out and say, look, you and I were supposed to fight. Hey, I'm still here. Right? I haven't lost since then. Right? When do I get my shot? Now, understand, with Usyk, it's a little bit different. Right? When you're 38, people understand that retirement is on the next block. Right? Retirement is going to be an eventual step. Now, all of these fighters claim they're going to fight forever, at least some of them. Right? There are very few Carlos Monzones in the sport. right? Guys who leave the sport and never come back. Marvin Hagler, right? Monzon was on top. Hagler had just lost to Ray Leonard, right? But there are very few guys like that. Rocky Marciano, Gene Tunney. Most guys swear to you, either that they're going to continue fighting or that they'll never fight again, then they end up back in the ring. I believe, just based on personality, that when Usyk leaves, he's going to leave. This, you're not going to get the feeling that he's making statements in the press that he's not going to honor, right? I think many people feel that way right now about Tyson Fury, right? 36, he claims he's retired for good, certainly has money in the bank, has a family, has a wife, right? Has kids. But you get the feeling that, if the purse number hits the right amount, maybe Fury comes back, right? Maybe not for Anthony Joshua, but certainly for Alexander Usyk, maybe for the man who beats Usyk. Well, just to understand, on the Usyk side of the ledger, the Moses Atama fight has some urgency, doesn't it? Right? Usyk's already conquered the United Kingdom. 2 victories over Olympic gold medalist, multiple heavyweight champion Anthony Joshua. 2 victories, the only 2 victories over Tyson Fury. Right? So, in terms of the storyline, right, Moses Atama is the UK's next wave at heavyweight. Right? The idea is, hey, player, you're 38, you're on the way out, above and beyond this generational thing. Are you going to leave a shoelace untied here in the United Kingdom? Right, that fight. Usyk, Moses Atama at Wembley. Oh, you tell me in the comment section of this YouTube video, how many fans do you think that generates? Right, understand with Atama too, there's a little bit more mystery than American Richard Torres brings to the table. Right, Torres, I can close my eyes and believe I know he's going to be on his front foot. Right? Atama's more of a mystery. Folks, mysteries sell tickets. Right? I was going around YouTube. I came upon a YouTuber's video. I'm all for free speech. I'm all for differences of opinion. This YouTuber thought that Atama showed leaks, is what he called it. If I find the video again, I'll put it in my favorites folder here. And he highlighted the ending of the fight, which you can interpret many ways. To me, it's brilliant. Right? You have Balajian jumping forward, and you have Atama with his offhand throwing the perfect right hook while backing up and dropping Balajian. Right? But for other people, they're concerned. What happened if that right hand missed? What happened if that right hand hit Balajian but wasn't strong enough to knock Balajian out? How prepared defensively was Moses Atama in that minute for a lunging Balajian? Right? Many of you in the comment section of my video made the comment, hey, Balajian, come on, we're not talking about a top heavyweight here. We're talking about some guy who lost to Murat Gassiev. Right? People are even pointing out that Balajian was trying to get up after the last knockdown. Right? Would Balajian be trying to get up after getting hit by, let's say, a Lennox Lewis, a Deontay Wilder, right? A Joe Parker? It's debatable. Right, folks? Whoever wins that Usyk Dubois fight, because they're getting all the belts, that's what undisputed means. Right? Because they're getting all the belts, they're going to have an opportunity to pick and choose who they fight next. Right? Understand, The winner of that fight can keep the WBO belt. Shrewd move by the WBO, by the way, but they can keep the WBO belt and fight the youngest prospect out there and have political cover. Right? You can imagine you're at a press conference, or maybe the guy's just, at a public event, right? Some movie premiere. Some sports writer jumps out of the crowd and says, "Hey man, why Moses Atama? Why not Parker?" Right? And of course, the champ would then be able to pivot and say, "Look, I'm fighting a number one contender. I'm fighting a guy who's unbeaten, unlike Parker." Right? You know, I can't fight everyone at the same time. Keep in mind too, the way the money sets up. You can say, Caballal, Parker, when they get the other belts, I'm game for a unification match. You should already know who I am. Because, of course, I would have been undisputed by winning the Dubois-Usyk match. Right? So, pay close attention to the WBO's rankings, folks. Moses Atama is the top contender in those rankings. Don't try to make sense of boxing. Right? Don't sit there and say to yourself, gee, how could Atama off of this fight, Balajic, leapfrog the crowd and be the top rated contender? Right? Don't think too hard about it. Right? You're thinking, wow, Fabio Wardley fought Fraser Clark twice. Fraser Clark would be one of the best opponents that Moses Atama has fought. I guess Marius Wack, an argument can be made, is the best guy he's fought so far. Don't strain your brain cells trying to make sense of boxing, thinking, wow, how do these guys jump? Effie Ajaba, Martin Bacoli. Folks, view it as entertainment, view it as a sanctioning body, realizing that this would be a blockbuster fight. And understand, too, if, the winds blow the other way, the winner of Usyk Dubois decides to fight Caballal, unbeaten fighter, right? Victory over Derek Chisora. Let's remember that. In addition to Zhili Zhang and Makhmudov, right? If they decide to fight Joe Parker, former heavyweight champion, understand how he loses his belt. He loses his belt to AJ in AJ's heyday, in AJ's backyard. Right? Well, understand the WBO is prepared for that, because then they can have the new generation become their champion, or fight in an elimination match against some other fighter, maybe Ricardo Torres. Maybe the branding would be, hey, you see all these guys over here over 30? We're the belt for this time, this generation, right? Assuming Dubois is not the winner of the Dubois-Usyk matchup. To close, let me just say, we might get the Usyk-Moses Atama fight next, and it would be sold to us as a fight for the WBO championship. Think about it. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Let me also address something else, too. Many of you are saying, look, Atama has been fighting the Marius Walks, right? Atama's been fighting the Balajics, right? Here's a list of heavyweights that he hasn't fought, right? Okay, look, I agree with that. I also agree with the idea that sparring is not a real fight. In other words, for all we know, Usyk could have been in the ring sparring with Martin Bacoli and could have thought, look, I need to improve my, back against the ropes game. I'm going to let this guy come across the ring and sparring. This is the place for me to work on skills that need improvement, right? The part of my game that didn't look good when I fought Derek Chisora, right? So let me be over here by the ropes, and I'll have, Bacoli come over here, and I'll, have him rough me up, and I'll see how I can block shots and stuff like that, right? Well, as you can imagine, in a real fight, an Usyk's going to be in the middle of the ring. He's going to be moving around. He's going to show the movement that caused Tony Bellew to demand that he fight in the pocket, right, during the fight, right? He's going to be elusive. That's a big part of his game. Movement, right? Being able to turn guys and stuff like that. So I'll agree, sparring is not the same as real fighting. In fact, Bacoli himself talks about how when he's sparring a guy who he thinks he might fight later, he saves a little bit of himself so that if an eventual fight takes place, he has that little extra. He has that element of surprise, right? But let's just say this. Look at Atama, right? He's with Ben Davison. He's sparring multiple champions, right? He sparred Fury. He sparred AJ, right? My point to you is simply, don't judge a guy who's sparred all these guys and who is, an A-level prospect, right? He's still unbeaten. Don't view him as completely a media job, a hype job, a fish out of water. One of the best interviews in boxing is Lawrence Okolie. Right, let me point out, too, I should be mentioning Okolie's name more. One of the best jabs in boxing, knows how to use length. He would be a tough opponent for a Moses Atama. Right, well, understand, someone asked Okolie who the hardest punchers in the heavyweight division were. And one of the names he named was a guy he had sparred with, who hit him, who surprised him. Moses Atama, right? For those keeping track on Okolie, cruiserweight champion, bridgerweight champion. Folks, he's been champion in 2 weight classes. To win the bridgerweight champion, he went to Poland, right? And fought in the champion's backyard, right? This is a guy who moved up to heavyweight and has looked good at the weight. Got a first-round KO. Right? He felt that Moses Atama was one of the hardest punchers in the heavyweight division. Right? After this last fight, I can't question it. Right? He drops the guy off a left. Right? It's a double left combination the guy throws. Then, with his offhand, he gets 2 dramatic knockdowns. Right? So it's 3 knockdowns, 2 of them with his offhand. Right? The fight doesn't make it to the 3rd round. Think about that. Right? So to me, the fact that, Moses Atama hasn't fought a lot of professional top guys doesn't necessarily tell me that he doesn't belong in the ring with top guys. Right? The great Cus D'Amato, who used to be the trainer for Mike Tyson, right? He had another guy who was one of the youngest heavyweight champions in history in the 50s. Pretty boy Floyd Patterson. Right? Now understand, Floyd, Cus D'Amato would set it up. In fact, Teddy Atlas is the person to really talk to about this. But Cus D'Amato would set it up where Floyd Patterson would have the equivalent of fights. They would bring in some guy. Patterson would gear his camp for fighting the guy. Then, of course, they would have, the pseudo ring walks. The guys would get in the ring together. The whole point of the camp was to have a fight that did not count against some major contender. Right? So understand, Patterson fought a lot of guys, but they weren't official fights. Right? So, my point to you is, look at Atama as a highly thought of fighter who's fighting top guys, hell, former champions behind the scenes, right? He looks ready to me. That Marius Walk fight, he gets Walk in a corner, doesn't allow Walk to leave the corner, does he? Right? So I think Atama is ready. I think to fight an Alexander Usyk, you need someone who brings an element of surprise, right? Who a Usyk is not going to know where he is. In other words, the guy can't be predictably front foot. The guy has to mix it in with other, tactics, right? Sidestep, back foot, right? The guy has to be deceptive. I'd love to see, and I know the public disagrees with me on this, they fought already. I thought Michael Hunter looked good in the early rounds against Alexander Usyk. I'd love to see Hunter in the ring against Usyk, right? The problem with that fight is that while I believe it would be elite boxing, right, the public doesn't really know Hunter well enough. The public knows Moses Atama well enough. Atama's a southpaw. Notice, too, look at the film. You're going to see Atama has his hand up, right? Atama's doing a lot of things where you realize this is an old soul. I don't care what the birth date is on the birth certificate. This is a guy who's not some free swinger. No, he's boxing, right? He has a hand up. He's defensively oriented. I think he would be an excellent matchup. Excellent matchup for Alexander Usyk. Right? Excellent matchup. The WBO has brought that possibility closer to fruition. Right? Take a look at it. Google WBO top contender heavyweight. You'll see Moses Atama's name. Right, folks? If I am Usyk and I beat Daniel Dubois, right, I pick Moses Atama. Right? The thought process might be off. Right? He might think, man, I don't want to get hit in the ribs by Kabayel, who's going to come in and test my body. Right? I don't want to deal with Joe Parker and his level of ring coverage. Right? Parker can be far away from you and land on you. Right? I'm going to take the younger, less experienced guy. Right? If Usyk thinks that way, he's making a mistake. What I'm hoping Usyk does instead is think, look, I'm 38. Let me be honest with myself. How many more fights do I have? Right? One of Usyk's trademarks is stamina. Right? What was lacking for Josh Taylor in his last fight? Just a side dig. Right? Usyk, stamina. To get Usyk's level of stamina, as you can imagine, he has grueling camps. I'm hearing about Usyk being underwater for periods of time and stuff like that. Right? He has grueling camps. How long is he going to keep that going? Right? He might realize, I only have a few fights left. Let me fight this young guy who people think's the future. You want to know who thought like that? Mayweather. Right? Mayweather saw Canelo. Canelo's unbeaten at the time. And Mayweather had the common sense to fight Canelo before Canelo became the monster that he is now. Right? So understand, Mayweather beats Canelo. How many years has Mayweather been retired? It's one of the biggest feathers in Mayweather's cap. It's like an ongoing annuity. You look at the Canelo record, who's beaten him? Floyd and Dimitri Bivol. Right? That's it. So as you see Canelo go on to great things, right? Gain weight, fight at weights that Floyd never fought at, 168, become undisputed in that division. In the back of your head, you're thinking, you know what? Mayweather beat this guy. So whenever there's a talk on Mayweather's legacy, you don't have to go back to his fight against Genaro Hernandez. You don't have to go back to his fight against Diego Corrales, right? You can look at boxing today. You could look at the short list of the best in the sport pound for pound. And you realize, okay, Floyd beat Canelo. Floyd must have been a bad man, right? If I'm Usyk, don't I want that? I'm looking at Moses Atama, I'm thinking, this guy might go on a multi-year run. Right, on the telecast, they were saying, they were throwing out big names, right? It was an interesting moment where they said, you know, many people feel that this might be the next Federer. If you're into tennis, folks, that's Mount Rushmore, Holy Grail type stuff, right? That's like talking about Pele in soccer. You know, you're like, whoa, 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 next Federer. Like, you know, next Messi. They actually named a soccer player. Next Messi. This was on the telecast. If I'm Usyk, I hear all of this. Legacy is a big part of boxing, right? Usyk knows right now he's in the Hall of Fame. So what can he do that brings that extra buzz if he's in the crowd at some movie premiere? Right? Mission Impossible, The Real Final Reckoning, 5 years from now. Let's say he's there and he's a celebrity and he wants that extra sparkle on his star. Right? And he's in the crowd and someone jumps out and, you know, he's a celeb. What can he do now to have future generations be able to look at a guy he beat, just like today's generation could look at a Canelo and say, yeah, Floyd beat him, didn't he? What can Usyk do for that kind of shine? I think he could fight Moses Atama. If he beats Atama and then leaves the stage, you know, he says, hey, you know, I'm about to turn 39. You know, 39's not too far away, right? You know, I'm out of here. Then, of course, if Atama goes on a run, right? You know, you're going to think, my goodness, you know, he lost to Alexander Usyk, right? There was a period in boxing where I would look at Julian Jackson and I would think, wow, he lost to Mike McCallum, right? You know, if Usyk is thinking that way, then the number one contender for the WBO belt makes sense as an opponent. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.